Hi everybody, this is Tom Callaghan from C-Risk. Today I'm going to talk a bit about how to define my top cyber risks within a given organization. This is a part of kind of a broader series of videos on risk quantification and the use cases for risk quantification. Now, many of our clients ask us to help them to define what's my overall cyber risk exposure. And of course the question is, how do you start with this? In my previous video on risk scenarios, I spoke about how to better define what a risk is and how to decompose it into a series of measurable risk scenarios. When we apply this to a macro level within an organization, the question is, where do I start? So in this video I'm going to cover three concepts. I'm going to go back over risk scenario definition at a very high level. I'm going to talk about how you identify digital assets, and I'm going to present a valuable tool which is basically looking at an organization's value chain in order to really identify the most important digital assets to then form risk scenarios. The first step in this exercise is to figure out my top risk scenarios. In the previous video we spoke about a risk scenario containing digital assets, impact, threat actors, and optionally vectors. So how do we pick the most important risk scenarios relative to an organization? Typically we find that in an organization you can break down the top risks into between 3 and 10 risk scenarios overall. You always start with the assets. So the first thing to do is to figure out what are your most important digital assets, very often referred to as your digital crown jewels. Once we have the digital assets, we can then think about the bad things that could happen to them or the impacts, and then start defining the different threat actors and vectors. So let me talk about how do you figure out what are your top digital assets. The first step in any risk quantification project at a macro level is to define the stakeholder group. This is typically a broad set of executives or subject matter experts that understand how the organization operates. Typically we work with these people through a series of interviews and also maybe reviewing existing documentation. However, it's important to have a kind of a tool or methodology to guide you through this process. And what we discovered over time is that it's super important to think about business or organization's value chain. So each business, according to their business model or the domain in which they operate, tends to have a similar types of value chains. We'll see that retail organizations work in similar fashion, banking organizations in a similar fashion, healthcare, medical device manufacturers, etc. What we've done is we've developed a set of generic value chain models which give us an idea of what to expect in terms of typical digital assets, how those assets interact, and what the core components are that support them are. As we walk through the process of interacting with stakeholders and reviewing documentation, we update these generic value chain models, which gives us a rapid and quick way of understanding what are the most important digital assets in the organization. In addition to collecting the information around the value chain and associated digital assets, we also think about profiling the organization from a measurable metrics perspective. So an example would be, we always strive to understand what is the revenue of the organization, what's the profit, what's the level of growth, how many employees, how many geographies does the organization interact within, and what are the business models? For example, is it B2B, B2C? Does the organization collect a lot of personal data, perhaps sensitive personal data, and what's the percentage of e-commerce business versus, like I mentioned, B2B or B2C. By combining these metrics about the business and the value chain, we basically have the information we need to build out a set of scenarios which really reflect the top risks of that business. So as I mentioned, once we have the value chain and the business metrics, we can then define the scenarios. Now, it's important to understand that you need to scope out each scenario in relevant to that business model, but there tends to be a standard set of scenarios available. We can think about things like endpoints, or personal data, or confidential information. The scenarios have a certain similarity across generic organizations, so we basically apply generic scenarios to our value chain and our metrics, and that allows us to build out tailored scenarios for each organization. We group those scenarios into what we call a risk universe. So these are like more of a view of the possible things that could happen. Then we prioritize them based on the probable loss event frequency, but also the size of impact. And this allows us to build our top risk scenarios, which tends to be between 3 and 10 scenarios. We can then look at those from an aggregate level and prepare an executive level or top-down board presentation on what are your top risks. So I hope this video was useful. Again, I guess the key points here are that when you're looking at defining the top risks, it's best to understand what the value chain of the organization is, the key business metrics, the corresponding risk universe, which is then prioritized. If you found this video of interest, please check out our YouTube channel where we have a series of videos covering a variety of topics within CRQ, and also look at our blog on our website.